cart in their oats to be milled, pay their fee to the baron, and bring it home again. So it was a tremendous way of controlling the population by how they lived. That was the most significant economic change, Kevin.
Do they know more or less how many people one millstone would support?
Well, I'm sure, you mean before they had done this? Pardon?
Crash, before they were broken.
Well,
There was one every such and such.
I'm sure that it was a direct reflection of the population in each little valley or river, wherever. Obviously, I would imagine that if you drive around Ireland, especially the west of Ireland, because it's still very unchanged, because you have the little stone walls and so on, you can see where the concentration of corn growing was. And they were not enclosures for animals, they were enclosures for corn growing. And all the animals were out in the unfenced areas, and they brought in the manure to put on the corn growing fields. And when you see a cluster of those stone walls and a mountain here and a riverbank over there and stuff, you can see this is where the folks lived, this is where they grew their corn, but they had the other areas then, the river bottoms and all the thing, they were part of their economic life, and that there was wildlife there that they used for furs and God knows what, everything. And then they had their cattle grazing on the commons and so on. It all really came together as one unit, as an economic unit. But they broke up those economic units, the Normans did, and they built these mill towns.
Every two would have one.
I don't know how. I'm sure they just eyed it up and said, well, yeah, this is, we'll do one over. I mean, you can kind of, when you drive around, you can kind of see just why they would do what they did. Because there'd be a hill here, well, yeah, the other side of the hill, we've got it's a whole different, because the people are not going to bring their donkeys and carts. Because, I don't know, maybe 10 miles might be about the maximum that you'd want to bring a donkey. Remember, the roads were like all maybe, and most of them didn't even have a wheeled thing. Most everything was carried on donkeys' backs with a basket on either sides called cleaves. Almost everything was carried that way.
They're still doing that in Iran in most villages.
Are they?
Yeah. They put on khorji in Iran. It's like Persian carpet. They put on either side.
Everything on each side, yeah.
Stuff like that. They have those mills that the water runs it. They crush their wheat to make bread. Right now, it's going on in most villages of Iran, and they bring the wheat to nearby towns to sell it for money. And there's no road in most villages.
Really?
Same thing.
Well, that's what Gandhi tried to reintroduce into India.
Yeah.
Because he was so wise, and if you ever really want to, talk about Al Gore, trying to read Gandhi. Gandhi he understood this so well because he was a very educated man, and he understood that everything had to be local. As he said, we cannot have a Lancashire Mills, or we cannot have a Yorkshire and a Lancashire in India, and he was so right. He was so right.
Had most of my relatives during the war between Iran and Iraq for 8 years. Most villages survived because they had nothing to do with the war. They were just staying there, and they would hear the news 6 months later, oh, this is happening, but they were just living a good life, and everything is there no matter what.
And eventually we'll have to go back to that. Whether we may be forced to go back to it, but eventually we have to go back to it.
My uncle has that village.
Because this centralization, it's interesting that we should have hit this nerve, and you should all come to, because that's what, from that moment onwards, everything became so centralized. We all have to drive down from Temecula to get it to a job in San Diego. Man, how ridiculous is that? So that's what happened.
The first Walmart.
Yeah, the first Walmart, But it had to do with power.
That's it.
That's how the nation survived even today.
Costco, right?
No, they don't.
Centralization at its max.
In the village where I come from, there is no store. Money doesn't do you any good. You can't spend it. There's nowhere to go and spend it. There's nothing to sell, nothing to buy. There's no electricity. There's nothing.
The donkey can't eat it.
I grew up on a donkey as a baby.
Well, yeah. So there's a huge lesson there, and then here's an economic system that had survived for thousands of years, not hundreds but thousands of years, and recycled was putting back what it took out of the system, so that the land was not overgrazed, and everything went back into the ground again. including the humans. It was organic, and that's why the soil was black, because it was all organic. When you look at the height of the black soil, it's not. That's human. That is the result of growing, humans growing and putting it back there. So, and that's almost sustainable indefinitely, whereas now it's not. Our system is not sustainable. Just is not sustainable. No matter what energy source we come up with. Anyway, that was the most important change, actually, was the destruction of the local economy and the imposition of a centralized economy. And while at first it would be very insidious, people would think, oh, well, this is actually good, because now we can produce more, I don't know what, but I'm sure they could figure that it's well worth the trip, because now we don't have to do this whole thing or whatever. Now the same with the wool. Essentially it was wool and potatoes didn't. The only reason, just on the side, you've heard me say this before, the only reason the Irish adopted potatoes, the real reason they adopted potatoes, was the one crop that the English couldn't destroy and subjugate them, because they wouldn't wait long enough to dig them up. But they could wipe out the crop, the corn crop, and destroy them. They'd burn the crops. Yeah, okay.
They would export Ireland's wheat back to the English market, right?
All over the world.
So all
Literally.
the Irish basically had them as the potato.
Well, but now remember, the potato is an aberration, and by the time you get to the potato economy, Ireland is done. Ireland is lost. It's gone. So that is not the real. That is not the Ireland.
Yeah,
The real
I see
Ireland
that,
precedes that.
Slow taking away of everything.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But even if they had remained, even if they had let the basic crops of wool and cereal crops or cereals, because grains, it would have gone on for a lot longer too. But the mechanization, anyway, we won't even get into that because it's kind of sad. But so between that period, between the bookends, if you like, of the Norman invasion and the Tudor invasion, that period in between, and we'll come back in 10 minutes here. The things that happened in the parts that they had occupied was great noble houses arose and great religious houses arose, very powerful, as a result of the centralization of the economy. Right? Think about it. Because they would grow up. Now, the religious houses played a very, very important economic part. To a large extent, they were also the millers. If you see what they did and they taught, so they were an economic center as much as a military or a commercial center. So that you had this centralization and growth in power, and then they built great houses, and they were largely undisturbed for about 2.5 centuries, with the one intervening event which was almost devastating, and that was the plague. But the interesting thing about that was, and I'll finish on this note, is that it was much more difficult, or much more punitive on the Normans than it was on the native Irish, because it killed off their cities, the people in their cities, and the rural population were largely unaffected by it because of the rats and all that stuff. And the result was that the Pale, because they were still, especially on the east side, the ones that went down in the country areas, they assimilated more. The Dublin never really assimilated that very much, but the Pale retracted, and so that the Pale suffered tremendously, and as a result, the rest of and it actually contributed quite a bit to the more Gaelicization, if you like, of the Normans, because the rural people did better, the language did better, and so on. But